Life in a castle. You've probably heard fairy tales about kings and queens and castles. There's always something magical going on in the fairy tales. Wizards, witches, and fairy godmothers are likely to be hanging around the castle, casting and breaking spells. Castles are real, however, even if some of the characters in these stories are not. Even today, you can see medieval castles all over Europe. Castles were designed to be fortresses. Kings and some nobles built castles to defend themselves and their estates against attacks. The forts were usually built on high ground. This way, the defenders could look down on the attacking enemy in the early Middle Ages. People built wooden forts with wooden fences around them. Surrounding the fence was a big ditch called a moat, which was often filled with water. If you were attacking such a fort, what would you do? If you answered burn it, you would have made a good general in the Middle Ages. Wooden castles were easy to build, but they provided little protection against flaming arrows. Kings and nobles realized that they needed to build castles out of stone to get any real protection from invaders. It was certainly a lot more work, but by the year 1000, many stone castles were being built in different parts of Europe. What did a stone castle look like? What was it like to live and fight in one? Read on and find out. Put yourself in the place of a king or noble in the Middle Ages. You need to build a castle. What's the first good thing you're going to think about? If you answered location, you get an A for good planning. A castle needed to be in a place that would be possible to defend. Have you ever wondered why many castles were built on hilltops? A hilltop was easier to defend. Soldiers could see their enemies coming. Castles had high watchtowers for spotting approaching enemies. The enemies had to march up the hill, while soldiers in the castle used weapons against them from above. Most castles were surrounded by tall stone walls and a water-filled moat. Some castles had more than one moat and more than one wall. Drawbridges would be lowered or raised to create or remove a roadway over the moat. These extra walls and moats provided additional lines of defense. Some castles also had underground tunnels for moving soldiers between different parts of the castle. On top of the walls, there were usually walkways from which soldiers could shoot arrows or dump boulders and hot oil down on the attacking enemy. Within the castle walls was a central tower called the keep. Some of the area near the castle keep was open courtyard. Other areas were covered. The keep was built to help people hold out for a long time against an enemy who surrounded the castle. In or near the keep were stables, workshops, a large oven, and a kitchen. There was a well for water and stalls for farm animals. There were also storerooms where grains and other foods were kept. These stores were not unlimited, however. Many people, kings, nobles, servants, and soldiers lived inside a castle. Unless food and supplies were replaced, they would eventually be used up. The chickens would stop laying eggs, and the cows would stop giving milk. Still, people could survive behind a castle's walls for many months. Castles and war. Castles were strong forts, but well-armed, patient attackers could take a castle. The battering ram was one method used by attackers. Many soldiers were required to hold up a huge log that was banged against the heavy ironclad castle doors until the doors broke open. Battering down the door was difficult. Castle doors were strong, and the men holding up the battering ram were under constant attack from defending soldiers high on the castle walls. Attackers also shot flaming arrows into the keep. The walls may have been stone, but castles still had buildings within made of wood. They also had hay in the stables and other items that could catch fire. Sometimes attackers would dig tunnels under the stone walls and weaken them to the point of collapse. Nevertheless, since castles were so strong, direct attack rarely worked. Most attackers relied on siege or blockade to win. In a siege, an attacking army would surround the castle so that food, weapons, and other supplies could not reach the people inside. Castles were prepared for sieges, but after weeks their supplies would run out. Then the attackers would attempt to take over the castle. Attackers used siege towers, tall wooden towers that rolled on wheels and could hold soldiers. These towers were rolled up to the castle walls. Soldiers climbed up the towers and over the castle walls. Nevertheless, a castle was a strong fortress. A small army inside could hold out for quite a while against a much larger attacking force. Sometimes what decided the battle was action outside the castle. A king or noble under siege would try to get word to other vassals to come to his aid. An army surrounding the castle had to be prepared to fight both the castle troops and another army. Life in a castle. Castles were very expensive to build, but that doesn't mean they were very comfortable to live in. In fact, by today's standards, living in an early castle would have been awful. These castles were cold, drafty, and even smelly places. Many people lived in a castle, but few of them had their own rooms or apartments. Most people lived and ate in the Great Hall, the largest room in the castle. In early castles, the king or noble and his family might have had beds in the corner of the hall. Everyone else slept on the floor, often piling any clothes they happened to have under and over themselves for warmth. The Great Hall was also used for meals. Again, only very important people would probably have had chairs to sit in, and everybody else would have sat on long benches alongside tables. After everyone had eaten, the tables were put aside to provide room to sleep. Some early halls did not even have fireplaces. An open fire was built in a stone hearth in the center of the room. It was probably more like camping than luxury living. It was hard to keep these castles clean. Dogs were allowed to run free in the Great Hall. There were no flushing toilets, just closets built into the edges of the wall. Waste fell into pits or moats along the outside of the castle. The most privileged occasionally took baths and washed their hands, but servants did not have many chances to wash. Over time, castles did become more comfortable, especially for the kings and nobles who lived in them. Fireplaces were added, more people had beds and their own bedrooms. Cold stone walls were hung with tapestries or even paneled with wood to cut down on drafts. The great room was still a center of activity, though. Musical performers, storytellers, and jugglers entertained people while they ate dinner, and long into the evening, too. Various forms of entertainment were especially important during the dark winter nights, when the only source of light and warmth in the castle came from the fire in the Great Hall. Castles were so well constructed that many still stand nearly 1,000 years after they were built. Castle building changed, along with advances in weapons and warfare during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, foot soldiers used bows and arrows as their main weapons. You can see how those thick castle walls would be a good defense against a bow and arrow. But towards the end of the Middle Ages, the use of cannons in battle made it easier to break down a castle's walls. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be inside a castle that was being hit by cannonballs?